Hi, Chris.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Good.
Let me introduce us. I am Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. This is the Wright Show, actually, and you are Christopher Ryan, psychologist and author, I guess co-author with your wife of the book Sex at Dawn, right?
Yep. Casilda Jetta is how you pronounce that.
That is to say your wife's name.
Exactly.
You're not saying that's how I should have pronounced Sex at Dawn.
No. Everyone shies away from saying her name. I did one interview, and the guy actually pronounced it Sausalito. I have no idea how he got to Sausalito from...
It's closer than Houston.
I guess so. Yeah.
So you're in California, speaking of Sausalito, right?
Actually, I'm in Vancouver right now. Yeah.
Oh, you're in Vancouver.
We're moving around, yeah. Last time I spoke with you, I was in Los Angeles, but now I'm in Vancouver. And we're normally based in Barcelona.
Barcelona's a great city. I've been there twice.
Yeah, I love it.
How about that Gaudi, huh?
How about him? Yeah, a lot of people say he was, his design was inspired by magic mushrooms.
You know, it's funny. When I was over there looking, and of course this architect who did these trippy buildings, and when I was over there, I was thinking, I can't believe he did these buildings before the invention of LSD.
Yeah.
And then now here's the explanation. He went organic.
Well, you know, the Catalans as a culture eat more different types of mushrooms than any other culture on Earth.
Including psychedelic ones?
Well, there are some psychedelic mushrooms that grow there naturally, yeah. Particularly Amanita muscaria, the Alice in Wonderland with the red cap and the white dots and all that, which has a long and fascinating history. But that's probably not what you want to talk about today. We can do another show on that.
Actually, well, no, let's get back to sex. Yeah, you're right.
I studied ethnobotany.
Enough about drugs. Enough about drugs, and we won't talk about rock and roll. Let's just talk about sex.
Fair enough.
So the way this started was you actually tweeted that you would, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you would enjoy kind of challenging some of my beliefs about evolutionary psychology. Do I have that right?
Well, not quite. What happened was people often say to me, who would you want to debate? If you were... sometimes I get invited to speak at events, and they say, who should we invite, to share the stage with you so you can have a spirited discussion about these controversial issues. And it's always sort of difficult for me to come up with someone because on the one hand, you could come up with someone who's going to have a very conservative perspective, a minister or, someone who represents a sort of right-wing perspective. But they're not familiar with the scientific literature, so it's not really an interesting discussion, And anyway, someone asked me recently, and I thought, Robert Wright. And the reason I said your name was because your book, The Moral Animal, blew my mind. And when did it come out? 92, 93? 96.
No, 4. I'm sorry, 4.
94. Okay. Well, when it came out, I read that book, and it absolutely blew my mind. I loved it. I was proselytizing evolutionary psychology, boring all my friends for about a year there. And it really set me on this path of thinking about how human sexuality has evolved and how it plays out and manifests in the modern world and all this sort of stuff, sort of thinking. Eventually, when I got to work on my dissertation and then Sex at Dawn, I had come around to a point where I was arguing against some of the central ideas that you present in that book. But I never stopped admiring the book. I never stopped admiring the way you write and think. And so it's with great gratitude, actually, that I'm speaking with you today.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad it happened. I'm a little, I'm curious as to how this is going to unfold because I'm not sure exactly which beliefs. Well, I kind of have some sense. I've read a little bit about your stuff, and I have some sense for some of the doctrines of evolutionary psychology that you want to challenge. I should say that I feel I'm not as well equipped as I could be, just because since I wrote that book, I haven't kept all that closely in touch with literature. I went on to write other books about history and God and stuff, and my brain couldn't fit in all the information, so some had to get shoved out. But why don't you start by telling us kind of What are some of the take-home lessons of your book that have generated controversy beyond evolutionary psychology? In other words, you said one person you might debate would be like a conservative minister. So why don't we back into evolutionary psychology? Why don't you first tell us what are some of the things you say that would arouse the ire of a kind of a moral conservative?
Well, I guess the first thing that would arouse their ire is that we very strongly confront the idea that there is any such thing as traditional marriage. You know, we're always hearing about traditional marriage is under threat, and traditional marriage is defined as one man, one woman, yada, yada, yada. But when you actually look at the anthropological literature on marriage, you find that there are different semantic games being played. First of all, anthropologists often argue that marriage is a human universal, and as you know, human universals are sort of the holy grail of evolutionary psychology. But when you dig down into the literature, what I found was that everything is being described as marriage. I mean, there are societies in which, you know, a woman will hang her hammock next to the man's hammock, and they're married, right? But there's
That's great.
yeah. And then, you know, she gets sick of him and she takes her hammock back and hangs it next to her mother's, and then they're divorced, right? And there's never been any expectation of sexual exclusivity or that he's going to take care of the kids or resource distribution or anything that we would consider, you know, part of marriage. And yet the anthropologists are saying, well, there's marriage, another society that practices marriage. So first of all, marriage is only a human universal if practically any male-female relationship qualifies. Secondly, this idea that marriage is always about one man, one woman, you know, and it has always included men's controlling the woman's sexual behavior as a way of, you know, affirming paternity certainty, again, is not supported by the evidence. So in that sense, it's a pretty subversive message because we're saying, you know, marriage is an economic institution. It's not an expression of human nature.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me, maybe we should try to clarify which of the things you said would annoy the average evolutionary psychologist and which would annoy only the moral conservative, right?
Right.
Because they're not exactly the same thing.
Sure.
Evolutionary psychologists would certainly not say that monogamy, well, nobody would say monogamy is a human universal. They also would not say, I mean, certainly I didn't say in The Moral Animal that lifelong marital fidelity is natural or easy for either sex. So in other words, some degree of promiscuity is natural, or at least a natural temptation for both sexes. And so, you know, monogamous marriage is a very hard thing to sustain. I mean, I think to the extent that I argued for monogamous marriage as the least bad of the various arrangements for organizing, you know, society, the idea was that polygamy has all of these downsides, and there are some benefits on the one hand to having two parents both committed to the rearing of children they think of as theirs. So that's the case for marriage, and then there's separately the case against polygamy. But I certainly don't think monogamy is naturally easy, or that it's any kind of human universal or anything like that. Now, as a separate matter, you're saying that you're going further and saying that, well, marriage per se. Are you saying there are many societies in which the father doesn't kind of invest in the children, or
yeah,
or identify the children even as his?
Well, yeah, we talk about several different examples of societies that should not exist if there were a universal human concern with male paternity certainty, right? Which is, I agree that most evolutionary psychologists wouldn't necessarily argue that sexual monogamy is human nature, or some would argue that polygamy is more in alignment with human nature, but there does seem to be sort of a bedrock principle in evolutionary psychology that it is human nature for the males to be concerned with paternity certainty, right? High male parental investment.
Well, even there, I would say I'm not sure how conscious the concern has to be. I mean, right. I would say, evolutionary psychologists say that males have evolved tendencies to increase the chances that the offspring of at least some mates. I mean, that doesn't mean males aren't interested in mating opportunistically and then heading off into the sunset. That's one thing. But there is also apparently a tendency to, in an actual, kind of courtship, sustained mating situation, for the male to do things that increase the chances that any ensuing offspring will be that man's offspring. And those include things like a certain possessiveness, and the possessiveness works both ways, but evolutionary psychologists would say differently. In other words, there is male, female, and there is male jealousy and female jealousy, but they are not the same. And they both make sense from a Darwinian point of view, and they both have to do with getting the offspring reared, but they're different. Anyway, and I think you challenge that specific idea as well. But anyway, my point is that the way I think of it is that males evolved a certain number of tendencies to increase, a kind of implicit confidence in paternity, but they're not necessarily aware of the way those things work.
Sure. Like many adaptations. But the problem is that this presumes an economic situation. This presumes nuclear families. This presumes resource distribution that the males are able to control. So that there's this sort of bedrock economic exchange in this vision of prehistory that you're outlining, where men are trading goods and services for female fidelity, whether it be meat, shelter, protection, status, these sorts of things. These are built into that vision.
Could be implicitly some trading of goods and services. I mean, you got to remember, it is in the interest of women to mate in Darwinian terms. It's not like mating is something they wouldn't want to do unless some guy provides a lot of goods and services.
By mate, what do you mean? That's such a slippery word. Do you mean have sex?
I mean have sex, which during evolution implied having children because there was no contraception if it was done, at least, if you have the sex while the woman is ovulating.
Right, but it doesn't necessarily imply a long-term partnership.
No, that part doesn't. But it would be in the woman's interest to have a man who felt invested in a given child.
Well, but now see, again, we're assuming a certain economic condition. If that's true, which I agree, it would certainly be in her interest to have assistance in raising the child and taking care of her when she's vulnerable, pregnant, and so on, then it would be even more in her interest to have several people involved. And so what we find is societies, half a dozen societies in the Amazon, some in Papua New Guinea and other parts of the world, in which anthropologists describe the system as a partible paternity, which is where people believe that a fetus is literally made of accumulated semen. And so a woman who wants to have a child who's the smartest and the funniest and the best looking and all that will make sure she has sex with the funny guy and the smart guy and the good looking guy, and to get some of the essence of all those different men into her baby. and then all those different men assume paternity. They participate in the ritual of naming the child and these different rituals. So fatherhood is seen as a group activity in these societies. And anthropologists have demonstrated that the kids who have these multiple fathers have a better chance of survival in those societies. And then yeah. And then you asked about other societies in which fatherhood is sort of a non-issue. We talk about the Mosuo in China, which are very interesting society. They've been around a long time. Marco Polo wrote about them in his travels. They're very interesting because they see any sexual encounter as being a unique event with no assumptions about continuation, and nobody has any control at all over anyone else's sex life. Women are as sexually autonomous as men. So what happens is that when the women become pregnant, what we would call paternal responsibility for the child falls to her brothers. The biological father has no role whatsoever.
Well, Richard Alexander wrote about this, and I think I was thinking that the society he was talking about was maybe in the South Pacific somewhere. But in any event, and he is a card. I don't know if you know of his work. He's not one of the more prominent ones, but he's a biologist at Michigan, and he did some pretty important work, quite early on, when I say he's an evolutionary psychologist, there's some technical issues involving nomenclature. I'm not sure he'd call himself that, but anyway, he subscribed to the kind of mainstream Darwinian consensus on this, and he himself documented a society where paternity confidence, because of the kind of mating patterns you're talking about, was sufficiently low that the closest thing to a father was the brother of the mother. Because, the brother of the mother can say with some confidence, assuming their mother wasn't fooling around. Okay?
Yeah.
So you could, the fraction is lower if that's the case. But anyway, I can say with confidence in principle that my sister's offspring have 1/4 of my genes.
Right.
Whereas if I know my wife is faithful, I can say with confidence that my kids have 1/2 of my genes. Okay. So in a society where the more promiscuity there is in a society, once that number, of course, it affects both fractions. It moves both fractions downward, but there's a point at which the relatedness fraction for uncle is higher. And Alexander argued that in a society like that, you will see uncles be the closest thing to fathers as we think of them,
right.
Maternal uncles. So I wouldn't say that everyone within the kind of mainstream Darwinian, I don't know what the current thinking is on the extent to which marriage, something like marriage as we think of it, monogamous or polygamous, is universal. What I would say, what seems to me to be the case, is that mechanisms that evolved to increase the chances of paternity confidence that seem to have evolved are one of a number of parts of psychology that have to be reckoned with. If you're just kind of, whether you're getting married or whatever you're doing, if you're just living life. Now, you may challenge that as well, right? You may. So here I'm thinking about a particular dimension of male jealousy, for example. The finding in evolutionary psychology, which was robust last time I checked, was that there is a difference in the nature of jealousy in men and women. That, relatively speaking, if you think of there being two kinds of infidelity, sexual and emotional.
Right.
In other words, the sexual is if my wife sleeps with a guy. Emotional is if she falls in love with him.
Right.
I am jealous of either of those things.
Right. You're talking about David Buss, right?
Well, he didn't do the theoretical work or the initial empirical work. That was done by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson.
Oh, right.
He did subsequent empirical work that further confirmed their work.
Yeah.
But they did the real Margot's no longer alive, but Martin, they were based in Canada. Martin is still there, probably at McMaster University. It's really good work because, okay, so first of all, the prediction is that men are going to, their jealousy is going to be geared more than a woman's jealousy to preventing sexual infidelity, because that's a bigger threat to a male, the threat of being cuckolded and spending his whole life rearing kids that aren't his. Whereas for a woman, even if she's married to the guy, if he's fooling around on the side, that by itself is not a huge reduction in the fitness chances of her child. Whereas emotional fidelity, it's a threat to both, but the thinking is it's a bigger threat to, say, the mother of a very young child if the husband, the father of that child, falls in love with a woman and leaves or begins really devoting significant amounts of time and resources to the woman he's fallen in love with. So you would expect that the relative emphasis of our jealousy mechanisms on sexual as opposed to emotional fidelity to differ in men and women. And last time I checked, the data was pretty robustly in favor of that. The beauty of what Martin and Margot did was they went back and looked in pre-existing data, survey data, various kinds of data about jealousy, where the survey hadn't even been designed to get at this question. But if you looked at the raw data with this in mind, it was already confirmed. It was already at least corroborated. Then they did more survey data. David Buss did the physiological data. But it's a very strong theoretical case. And the last time I checked, it had a fairly diverse empirical corroboration.
Two things I would say about that. First of all, when people went back and ran the same studies but didn't limit the options to I would be more upset about the emotional versus I would be more upset about the sexual, and they added the third option, which is I would be equally upset about both. By far, most people chose that third option. So there's something artificial about forcing people to say I'd be more upset about this versus more upset about that.
Well, how do you explain the fact that when they do force them to make that choice, the data are so clear? Do you have an explanation for that?
Sure. It's well known that men are much more visual and that we have a much easier time visualizing and feeling physiologically affected by our visualizations of a sexual situation, and women tend to be more narrative and think about stories. If you look at porn that appeals more to men versus women, you see men are much more visual, women are much more story-oriented. So the romance is a much more story. It's more of a verbal kind of thing, if you will. It's very difficult to visualize love, whereas you can visualize sex very quickly. So that fits into what we would expect. But I think
that seems to me like a slightly strained explanation. But
well, maybe. But here, I don't think it's anywhere near as robust as you're depicting it, simply because everybody in that subject pool is from a post-agricultural society in which resources are distributed to women by way of men. It's only very recent. I mean, we're talking in your lifetime and mine, where it's commonplace for a woman to have her own direct access to resources, and still women are getting paid, 70 cents on the dollar to what men are getting in the United States. So I think we can't look at these responses and behaviors without taking into account the context in which this appears. And my problem with the work that David Buss has done, which, I admire it, and I couldn't have written the book without research from him and many other people, is that, he thinks that by surveying college students in 20 different societies, he's getting a look at universal human behavior, whereas those are all college students. So by definition, they're all at least middle to upper class people, all raised in post-agricultural world, which is, as you know, a very recent development in terms of human evolution. So, I mean, I didn't read your book, Zero Sum, but it's on my list. And we live in a very zero-sum world, economically speaking. But if you look at hunter-gatherer societies like those in which our ancestors presumably evolved, it was not a zero-sum situation. The central organizing economic principle of hunter-gatherer societies, as you know, is fierce egalitarianism and an insistence upon the sharing of resources. So this assumption that a man is going to invest...
the food resources, but certainly you would agree that the anthropological literature is fairly rife with accounts of men in those kinds of societies behaving very possessively toward females. I mean, you may be able to point to societies that you say don't fit that model, but there's a lot of evidence a lot of cases to the contrary, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, are you saying that the kind of the kind of Margaret Mead in Samoa, right? Her book where she went and claimed that they were relatively free of jealousy and stuff like that. And then, of course, there was this revisionist work by Derek Bickerton. No, not Derek Bickerton. By what was the guy's name? Freeman, I think.
Derek Freeman, yeah.
I mean, is that, are you saying that if we go in general to pre-agrarian societies, we will find something like what Margaret Mead described?
I'm saying it's very likely, yes. If those societies exist or existed and were uncontaminated by, Christian missionaries and others coming in and immediately shaming that aspect of society, which is the first thing that they tend to do. We find in the book there are dozens of examples of precisely this sort of behavior, relatively non-possessive. And again, I mean, we could debate this aspect for a long time because, as you're certainly right, there are many examples of the contrary in the anthropological literature, and then I can keep coming up with counter examples and so on. But let's take it down to a more basic level. Let's just look at a biological level, right? Why human beings have sex about 1,000 times for every live birth, right? We've extended receptivity, concealed ovulation, all these biological terms point to the fact that the human female is willing and able to have sex whether or not she's ovulating. Mm-hmm. And that's very unusual among primates, among mammals in general. You said there are adaptations to try to increase the possibility of paternity, and there certainly are also on a biological level. But those adaptations only make sense if we assume that our ancestors evolved in the context of sperm competition, right? The genital anatomy, all these different things we go through in the book, showing that these things only happen in species in which there is promiscuous mating behavior.
But that's not controversial within evolutionary psychology. There's a consensus that and a lot of it has to do with the male anatomy seems designed for a world in which there is sperm competition, which is to say a world in which there was a non-trivial chance that the woman you're having sex with today had sex with another man yesterday or an hour ago, right?
Right.
So that part is, to put some degree of emphasis on sperm competition and the historical and prehistoric promiscuity of women is not a departure from mainstream evolutionary psychology, right?
Well, but as you summed it up in your book, you said that men and women seem designed to make each other miserable. That there's this mutual exploitation built into the the evolved design of human beings. And what we're arguing in the book is that no, that's like the main point where we would disagree with your argument in The Moral Animal. I don't think we're designed to make each other miserable. I think that in the pre-agricultural world in which private property was a non-issue, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, nobody had, you look at the Old Testament line we all know, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, right? And mm-hmm. It appears to be an imploration that we respect the neighbor's marriage and, don't get involved in his love life. Actually, read it in context, nor his house, nor his ox, nor his she-maid, and nor his,
Right.
his slaves. It's stay away from your neighbor's stuff, right?
Right.
So
Because not respecting those various things will drive him nuts and disrupt society. So
Well-
that itself is a testament to the power of male jealousy and male possessiveness of non-human property.
right, but you're looking at a post-agricultural context in which
then
people
what-
accumulated property, right? And
Okay.
that wasn't
Oh, I see what
happening
you're
until
saying.
10,000 years ago
Okay.
at the very earliest.
Well,
So in
let me.
a world in which you don't have any property to pass on to your heirs, who cares?
Wait. I think here this is where I'm really going to differ with you on theoretical ground.
Okay.
First of all, let me emphasize when I said I think I did say probably men and women seem designed to make each other miserable. I didn't mean to seem literally. I didn't mean to say literally that's a criterion of evolutionary design. You know, it's not like natural selection doesn't want us to be miserable any more than it wants us to be happy. It doesn't care. But what I meant was when you look at the design criteria that do lead to kind of sometimes conflicting aims in men and women, unconscious aims perhaps, that, they are designed to, they seem designed sometimes to make each other miserable. And let me give you an example. Even when there's not private property, okay, it's good if a woman could somehow manage to leave lots of men under the impression, and I don't mean conscious impression, right, that they are the father of a child, but you know what I mean. I mean, like they are the unconscious or whatever psychological mechanism, falling in love with a kid, and investing in the kid. It doesn't have to be a society with a lot of private property for that to be a valuable thing. If a man invests in a child, that can mean defending it against predators, defending it against other humans, giving it some food. It can mean all kinds of things. And so there would have been an interest in a woman, in principle, leaving more than one man under the impression that he's the father, and that could explain why women are sexually receptive throughout the cycle, including when they're not ovulating. Of course, there's a big... The problem is that in a very small-scale society like that, it's a risky business. It's not as easy to have a sexual encounter that won't become known to other people as it is in a big city, right? So there is that constraint. But anyway, the point is that, in principle, it would be in the interest of a woman to leave lots of men under the impression that they're the father of the child, even if they're not. But if you look at the male's interests, it's very bad for the male to be under the false impression that he is the father of a child, because then he's going to expend resources on a child that he's not closely related to, which in Darwinian terms is bad. Okay, so
which resources?
Protecting the kid, risking his life to protect the kid. Go save the kid when the kid is drowning.
So
go fend off a predator. Teach the kid skills. Give the kid food. Okay, investment. The term investment should not be taken in too modern a sense.
Sure, but a hunter-gatherer group, right? Everybody's known each other their entire lives. They've seen each other give birth. They've been hunting together their whole lives. It's a very intimate situation. There are a couple of kids sitting under a tree, and somebody notices that there's a snake, a poisonous snake, near the kids. Mm-hmm. Are people calculating their relatedness to those kids before they start screaming and chase the snake away?
Look, none of this happens consciously to begin with. So calculating is not the right word. When I run into a building to save if I run into a burning building to save my daughter or my brother, I'm not going to do the math first. It has to do with the strength of the emotional attachment to the person.
Right.
And that, in turn, is what has been shaped by a kind of unconscious calculation of what the likely degree of relatedness is. Okay?
Well, that's only one thing. That's only one factor that goes into this sense of emotional relatedness.
What is only one factor that goes into
the possibility that I'm related to that kid?
What are the other ones?
How much I love that kid.
That is the dependent variable. I mean that is what I'm explaining as being a function of the degree of relatedness.
Possibly.
That is the mechanism by which altruism is mediated. Okay. So that's what I'm saying. That's when I said it's not a conscious calculation.
It's only one mechanism by which altruism is mediated. It's
okay,
not.
What are the others aside from emotional attachment?
Well, emotional attachment is not purely a factor of relatedness, of genetic relatedness.
No, there's also a separate evolutionary dynamic called reciprocal altruism that can explain a kind of emotional attraction. But when you're talking about the kind we associate with kinship, you know, I mean, there are other dynamics that can explain a sense of obligation to a person, a sense of emotional attachment to a person. But my point is, it makes total sense. Long before there was much in the way of private property, for evolution to have been making our degree of emotional attachment to kin and to mates to be subordinate to this calculus.
Well, again, you're assuming that kin is a known and highly valued.
No, I'm not assuming. I'm not assuming it's consciously known. Okay.
Right.
I mean, it usually is affirmed by terminology. Okay, like I know my brother as my brother, but it could be something like, you know who your mother is, right? In all societies, you have somebody you think of as your mother. And if an offspring shows up and is nursing, your mother is the female overwhelmingly cradling it and nursing it, that then you develop a sense of affection to that person, whether or not they even call it your brother. There could be a mechanism like that at work, which would make sense in Darwinian terms, because you probably are related to that guy. So it's not conscious. It's not a calculus. You certainly don't think, well, my degree of relatedness is X, and you may not have to have the formal assignment of terminology. That is my brother. I mean, we don't know, but there are certainly other species in which kin-based altruism exists, and they're not smart enough to go around saying brother and sister.
Yeah, sure. But when you look at the anthropological data, what you find is that in many societies, naming rituals, for example, are considered more important by the people in the society than actual biological kinship. So we're assuming that this is something that's very important in these societies, whereas in many societies it simply isn't. I think we're projecting a lot of modern intellectual constructs into prehistory, and I think we have to be very, very careful about that because it's very distorting influence.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Sure, I won't necessarily answer it, but you can.
Have you ever experienced sexual jealousy?
I'm sorry?
Have you ever felt sexual jealousy?
Yeah, sure.
Do you think it was a cultural construct?
Largely, yes. I think it's a combination of a cultural construct and sort of a basic insecurity about losing something that you can't replace.
Well, but I mean, I guess the kind of scenario I'd imagine, and here this may be getting way too personal, but I guess the variables I'd want to control would be like, okay, you're not going to lose the person. You just know they're out having sex with a guy right now.
Right.
Now, I maintain that anyone who's I maintain that that's not merely a cultural construct.
All right.
And on the side of that, I think is the fact that at least the popular depiction of all these commune experiments, and I've even heard some testimony from people who were on these communes that flourished in the late 60s and 70s, they worked hard to strip the cultural underpinnings of jealousy away, and it just didn't work.
Well, of course not. You don't fight against 10,000 years of cultural, underpinnings in 10 years. It's. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you've ever been to a swingers convention, as I have, I was invited to speak at the biggest swingers convention in the world in Vegas a few years ago.
Why don't I get these kinds of speaking gigs? I mean, it's like I go to Unitarian churches,
Well, I'd be happy to set you up. They've actually invited me for next year as well, but it's Vegas in August, so you might not want to go. But, you know,
Well,
there are 3,000 couples registered in one
sure.
hotel. And believe me, there's not a lot of jealousy being experienced there.
Well, I
Quite the
mean, you don't know,
opposite.
you are not around for the conversations between the couples afterwards. But I'd say a couple of things. First of all, in sheerly Darwinian terms, if a man, if another man has sex with his wife and he has sex with the man's wife, that's not a net loss, okay? So, and you know, we know about societies in which there is a certain amount of kind of mate lending and stuff. So that's not necessarily some kind of major defiance of the math. The other thing is, who knows how many of these couples are committed couples, and how many of them just say, hey, why don't we go in there as a couple, you know, and it'll work for both of us. We'll find somebody we both like, and, you know.
Yeah. Well,
Right?
there is research on this.
Yeah.
But there's, and it turns out that most swingers are long-term couples. They tend to be high socioeconomic status, highly educated, and they report higher relationship satisfaction than conventional married couples do. And I mean, I guess.
Okay, but one question.
Yeah,
what
go ahead.
percentage of American couples would you say have chosen that lifestyle?
I don't know. I haven't looked at the literature.
I would guess about 1/1000th of 1%.
No, certainly not, and certainly not if we're talking about same-sex couples.
Well,
where
that's a different story altogether. I'm not talking about that.
Right. So, but that's a significant percentage of, you know, overall couples. But I mean, to get into the cultural thing, you know, there's a chapter on jealousy in the book. It comes up a lot, right? And I think, you know, of course, there's an insecurity about losing something, and that is often expressed in terms of sexual jealousy. But, you know, first of all, according to the Darwinian understanding, if I understand it correctly, that you should be less jealous of your wife having sex with your brother than having sex with a stranger, right? Because you're more likely, even if your brother gets her pregnant, some of your genes, shared genes with your brother will be involved. That doesn't seem to play out in real life.
In some theoretical sense, in some mathematical sense, that may be true. I mean, it may be that in terms of the intensity of the emotional reaction to discovering that your brother is sleeping with your wife, there are added elements like outrage at the betrayal of a brother or whatever.
Sure. Good point. But as far as the cultural aspect of this, one of the things we talk about in the book is how in some of these societies there are rituals that are expressly designed to minimize sexual jealousy, right? It's seen as ridiculous and pathetic, or there are, you know, festivals where you have to have sex with someone other than your normal partners, and so they sort of design to mix it up and keep people from fragmenting into smaller relationships. But then we've got societies that enhance this feeling of sexual jealousy, right? Like we talk about one of the number one, you know, the best known love songs of all time, When a Man Loves a Woman. And if you actually listen to the lyrics of that, he'll turn his back on his best friend. He'll spend his last dime. He'll sleep out in the rain if she says that's the way it has to be. You know, is that love? I mean, what the hell is the message in a song like that?
I think what that is a song that a lot of women like to hear. I think that's a song designed to appear to, you know, total commitment.
Yeah.
Total commitment.
Right.
That appeals to women, and I would say, you know, part of the reason is Darwinian.
See, now, I would say that part of the reason is this a sort of evolved predisposition transplanted into a modern socioeconomic context in which women are only going to get a dime if they get it from a man, right? Women who have a baby and don't have a man providing for them are cast out into the street as whores and, you know, and abandoned by society. So I think that's why they're so dependent. That's why there's such an urgent need to have a man who's committed to them and provide for them.
Well, I guess I'd say, well, what would you expect if you were going to go do a survey experiment? What would you expect to be different in women who are financially self-sufficient?
I think they would be much less concerned with sexual exclusivity. I think they would be much more relaxed about having children without.
You mean you mean they would be more comfortable with their partners having sex, or with them having sex with multiple partners?
Both. And I think that's what we find when we look at societies like that. Scandinavian societies, for example, in which government provides health care for everybody, takes care of the kids, gives a stipend to the women for child care. You find a much more relaxed approach to sexuality and monogamy and marriage in societies like that.
You find the same themes, probably in Bergman movies, but certainly in, it's just, these are just not kind of jealousy free societies.
Well, I'm not saying they're jealousy free, but I'm saying it's much more mitigated. It's much lower level than in societies where women are like North African societies, where women are completely dependent upon men.
Yeah. Well, let me emphasize that there is a huge amount of cultural variation, and people are quite malleable. You can certainly, it's in principle possible to extinguish jealousy. If in the end the only way to do it is to go in and tamper with the brain or give people drugs, fine. But certainly, it's in principle it is doable, and there are ways to diminish it through therapy, meditation, making yourself less possessive. So I'm not kind of saying that some specific degree of jealousy is hardwired. On the other hand, I think that, and I think cultures are among the manipulations of psychology that can calibrate these things.
Sure.
Up or down. There's no doubt about that. I mean, if you look at the attitudes of men in some polygamous societies, as opposed to the attitudes of men in a monogamous society, right there, you see, cultures can have a huge effect, and the attitudes of the women. But I'm just saying, I think that both clear and I think compelling theoretical reasons and the support of, last time I checked, fairly substantial data leads me to believe that at the end of the day, there are some basic tendencies that you are having to reckon with when you do, work to moderate these things.
Sure.
And there's also variation that is kind of natural. So, for example, as women get older and less fertile, and certainly when they pass menopause, the prediction is that males would be less possessive of them, less jealous. And again, last time I checked, that had been corroborated empirically. So I don't want to minimize the amount of either cultural variability or malleability of human psychology.
Oh yeah, my God. Yeah, and religious. I mean, I guess that would fall under the rubric of cultural, but
culture is one form of programming.
Yeah. I mean, to sort of boil it down, what we argue in the book is that human sexuality is not primarily about reproduction. Right? It's about establishing and maintaining complex social networks. And that's why the ratio of sex acts to live birth is so high in humans, higher than in any other mammal that I'm aware of, certainly any other primate. And, you look at our closest related primates, the chimps and the bonobos, both of them are promiscuous maters. And in bonobos, certainly, male paternity is a very minor concern, if a concern at all. In chimps a bit more, but still it's not, chimps don't pair off into little nuclear families.
Yeah. I mean, we're not terribly closely related to either of them. I mean, it's been 4-6 million years since we branched off. They are our closest relatives, but then if you look at others that are, yes, more distant relatives that are apes, you see that it is certainly possible in a species that has very little cultural overlay, like gorillas or gibbons, to see what seems to be the manifestation of a high degree of paternity certainty, mechanisms designed to ensure it. In the case of gorillas, they're polygamous. In the case of gibbons, they're monogamous. And, of course, gibbons are different from humans because they're not they go live alone, the
Right.
pairs, right? And so that's one mechanism for ensuring paternity. But the point is, the kinds of mechanisms I'm talking about in humans, or I'm talking about, are known to in principle exist in primates independent of culture.
Fine, but do you know how many primates? There are 300 and some primates, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many of them live in large multi-male social groups that are monogamous? None.
Well, we're special in a lot of ways. Again, I'm not saying we're naturally monogamous. That is not a claim of any evolutionary psychologist. The sheerly physiological data, like sexual dimorphism, difference in sizes between the sexes, suggests that we have not been monogamous through our evolutionary history.
Well, and if you get into even more specific indications, like the size of the gorilla's penis is the size of your pinky finger, right? And gorilla testicles are the size of kidney beans. These sorts of things are very strongly indicative of a high level of promiscuity in the human evolutionary past.
Relatively high, but not nearly as high. If you look at, say, testes size compared to body mass or whatever, and put us on a graph, we do not come off nearly as high as the chimpanzees. So that suggests that closely related to them as we may be, they are naturally more promiscuous, and then there was more actual promiscuity,
well,
I think I'm getting this right, than there was in humans during their recent evolutionary history.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, that's true if you only look at testicular size. But if you look at spermatogenetic potential of testicular tissue, if you look at the number of sperm in an average ejaculate, we're almost at the level of chimpanzees, because the human ejaculate's about 4 times the size of the chimpanzee ejaculate. If you look at the length and girth of the penis, then we're all the way at the end of that graph. So if you look at these, the reproductive anatomy, if you sort of group it all together and make that graph, you find humans way up there with chimps and bonobos. And by the way, we're actually quite closely related. Humans are more closely related to chimps and bonobos than they are related to any other primate except each other. And we're more closely related to them than an Indian elephant is to an African elephant, So we're not very distant.
Yeah, but, we are. I mean, come on, look at the human brain. A whole bunch has happened since we parted ways with them.
Yeah,
okay?
Sure. To the brain, not so much to the genitals.
Well, the brain is what we're talking about here.
I'm talking about genitals. I don't know.
No, the genitals are evidence of the kinds of mating relationships that prevailed.
Right.
But when the mechanisms we're talking about evolving in response to those arrangements are psychological.
Yeah, sure, no doubt. Yeah, the chimps they don't have any blues songs to worry about. That's for sure.
No, they don't. They get the blues, but they don't have the songs. So I don't know. Well, this is interesting. I hadn't heard that there was one piece of data there you just reeled off that I hadn't heard, which is something about the tissue, the sperm generating capacity of the testicular tissue or something.
Right.
So maybe that's shown up since I last looked at this. But it is certainly not the claim of evolutionary psychologists that we're naturally monogamous. I mean, I think of my book, The Moral Animal, as being, to a considerable extent, about the ways in which lifelong monogamous fidelity is not natural.
Mm. Right, but you're right, of course, that they're not...
For either men or women.
They're not necessarily claiming that long-term monogamy is natural, but they are claiming that there's this essential war between the sexes, that women want one thing and men want something else. Women are trying to...
There are conflicts of interest. Yeah.
Well, but those conflicts of interest, as I keep saying, are largely a result of the socioeconomic context of the post-agricultural world, a world in which women needed to manipulate men in order to survive. And that's not the world in which we evolved. In the world in which we evolved, women had direct access to what they needed to survive. Women gathered more of the calories for the diet than men did. So women weren't dependent on men for survival the way they have been in the post-agricultural world, and therefore men weren't a conduit for resources in the way that they have been.
Well, I think there are. I mean, first of all, I would contend that some of the conflicts of interest are inherent in the kind of the fundamental in the fact of that a woman can reproduce only once every few years in a natural kind of society where she would nurse for several years after birth, and a man can in principle reproduce every day. I would say that alone generates some natural tensions. But as for the access to food, I mean, in a lot of hunter-gatherer societies, men do much of the hunting, right? And that's a very high protein source of food. I'm not saying it was always, I'm not talking about some kind of sex for food swap, but...
Sure, men do the hunting, but women do the gathering. And most of the food comes from the gathering. So men are every bit as dependent on them.
But much of the protein comes from the hunting. The other thing is survival was very, very precarious. I mean, it just seems to me it's not like sustenance is this binary thing. Oh, if you can go gather enough food to support a child, you're done. No, in an environment like that, all kinds of things probabilistically increase the chances of the survival of your offspring.
Right. And you know what the number one thing is? Risk being mitigated by sharing within the group. That's why food hoarding is seen as the worst thing you can possibly do in most hunter-gatherer societies. So we're not arguing a Rousseauian sense that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were more noble than we are or anything. Because what we're saying is, as most anthropologists have said, that fierce egalitarianism and sharing as a universal social value were the best way of assuring survival of most of the group. And a lot of this sort of boils down to the debate between multi-level selection and the more sort of conventional, traditional view that's going on now between Wilson and others. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that you're right. There are many factors involved in this, and the factor that I would say, and I think a lot of people would agree, was the most determinative is social cohesion. That's what humans do better than any other animal. And social cohesion is reduced by not fighting over women. And what's the best way to not fight over sexual access? To share it. The same way you eliminate fights over resources, over food, over all this kind of stuff. So, you said, well, there are biological conflicts built in by the fact that men produce so many sperm and, women only produce a certain number of ovums and all that, ova. But that applies to bonobos as well, right? I mean, a male bonobo produces far more sperm than any female bonobo can ever use. And yet, you find a very low level of conflict between males and females in bonobo societies.
Okay, let me say one. We're at an hour, so we should stop. But let me say one more thing, and then I'll give you the last word. Just in response to the social cohesion thing, sure, social cohesion is nice, all other things being equal. But it is still the case that within populations, some individuals' genes survive and some don't. Some live and some die. Animal populations, non-human animal populations, human populations, and more crucially, remember, some males particularly can out-reproduce their peers by large amounts. That's not so possible for women, precisely because they can only have a child every 3 or 4 years. But for men, they can, in principle, impregnate a number of women. In Darwinian terms, that is such an important part of the bottom line that it just isn't the case that you could expect social cohesion, although it may, social cohesion is probably in a sense selected for whether you're an individual selectionist or a group selectionist. But my point is, there are these other things being selected for, definitely, at the individual level, like which males reproduce most, that are naturally going to be in tension with social cohesion, okay? And you cannot expect the process of natural selection to have neglected that part of the calculus. Now, having said that, and also conflicts between women and conflicts between women and men. There are just all kinds of conflicts between individuals that have genetic repercussions, and resources are finite. So notwithstanding all the non-zero-sum dynamics within a society, there are lots of zero-sum games going on in Darwinian terms, and I think that's bound to take its toll. Now, having said that, I will let you have the last word.
All right.
It'll be hard. It'll be hard. I'm going to have to muster a lot of self-restraint, but humans are malleable and can do that.
Well, we'll see. I'll keep it very brief. I'll just respond to one point you made, which is that some males will reproduce more than other males, and that's a driving force in evolution. Granted, I completely agree with that. Where I disagree with you is that is necessarily a source of tension in a hunter-gatherer band society, in which the selection is happening at the level of the sperm cell and not at the level of the individual male. That's why we have external testicles and the largest penis and all this other stuff that we talked about earlier, because as George Bush said, we're fighting them out there so we don't have to fight them here. Same thing. We let the conflict take place within the woman's reproductive tract, then the males don't have to fight. That's why males have quick orgasms and then lose all interest in sexuality, and yet females, this interest in sexual interaction continues to build, right? That's why women can be multi-orgasmic and men aren't. All these things.
Wait, I'm not sure I follow. I'm not sure I follow that. This doesn't constitute a reply by me. This is just a question to flesh that out.
All right. What the multi-orgasmic?
Yeah. What is the reason that men have an orgasm and then, for the time being, have no interest in further sex, whereas women are different?
Well, it makes sense if you think about human sexuality taking place in a group situation. And as you said, it's very difficult to have sex with someone in a band level society without everyone knowing about it, particularly given the fact that female copulatory vocalization is so high in humans and other promiscuously breeding primates. That's why women make more noise in bed than men do generally. So all these things fit in together to show that human sexuality typically took place in a way where the determination of which men reproduced more took place within the woman's reproductive tract. And it was based upon sperm cells, the vigor of the sperm cells, and certain post-copulatory mechanisms that women have built in. So all this stuff is in the book. So if you ever get around to reading the book, I'd be more than happy to continue this discussion.
Okay, well, to call the amount of self-restraint I had to exercise not to apply to that heroic would be to understate it. But...
Congratulations.
But such is my degree of self-control that I'm going to... So thank you so much for coming on, Chris. I'm really glad we had the conversation. And your book is called Sex at Dawn, which something, by the way, is something I am in favor of. I want to go on the record.
All right, I'm holding up a cup. Not
your book necessarily, but Sex at Dawn.
Yeah.
Your book I haven't read, so I can't judge. But
well,
this has made me want to. I have to admit.
Give us a negative blurb, and we'll put it right on the cover.
Okay, nonsense.
50 Shades of Grey.
Not since the Holy Bible has any book so misunderstood the process that created human beings. How's that?
That's great. Now let me write that down. We'll use it right now.
Any blurb that begins "not since the Holy Bible" is a winner.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Hey, it was great talking to you, and really, it's a wonderful thing to talk to you all these years after reading The Moral Animal. I thank you for that. That's a wonderful book.
My pleasure. Enjoy Canada.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.